Hello and welcome to episode number 49 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, May 17th, 2015. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Karen and Kristin, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourselves and tell us about what you do?
So, again, Melissa, it's great to be on your podcast again. It's a great resource for all communication crisis professionals. So thank you again. I'm Karen Freberg. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and I teach in the strategic communications specialization at the university, but I do crisis, social media, and PR research.
And I'm Kristin Sailing. I'm Karen's sister. So we are a family of collaborators. I am a major in the U.S. Army. I'm currently working out at U.S. Pacific Command, and I have been working on basically the metric development behind crisis messaging. I'm a systems engineer by background, and we do metric development and value modeling kind of as a matter of course. So Karen kind of brought me in to consult on some of her crisis communications projects, and I ended up just being totally nuts over the study. So we've been collaborating on that for a bit.
Very cool. So tell us about the study.
The study in question, we're talking about using the situational cue sort to construct the crisis message preference model. Is that the one where?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a tongue twister.
There's so many different variations on the situational cue sort. It's been the situational cue sort is a really versatile tool for helping researchers to quantify qualitative subjective impressions. So Karen and I have had a bunch of fun playing with this.
Yeah.
And you can tell we're total geeks because we're just like, oh, numbers, we get to play with metrics.
Numbers!
Which is interesting, especially when we're talking crisis communications.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, Karen and I started on this project. I'll just kind of give the rundown, and then I'll hand it over to her to talk some of the actual specifics. When we started just batting around it's a relatively simple question in construct, but you guys working in crisis, as long as you have, it's not simple. What actually makes a good crisis message? So when we say this is a good message, what do we mean? How can we kind of go through by the numbers and quantify that? So we started breaking apart messages into different characteristics, different subjective categories, and trying to determine different rating scales. After a while, we started looking at seeing how we could take these quantifications of crisis messages and apply them to particular audiences. What does that particular audience expect from a good crisis message? And we're looking at how that kind of goes across different groups, from crisis professionals to people who are just regular community members to people who are on a particular board or a decision body. So that's kind of what we're doing with this.
Okay. So I know, Karen, you're probably going to take it up, but just two questions to kind of just clarify. What types of crises are we talking about?
That is a great question, Melissa. And so, as Kristin said, this has been an ongoing project. We've been using the situational cue sort methodology, which technically is a method that originated in psychology. And as our mom, the original Dr. Freberg, is a psychologist, the family that does research together, and all that kind of stuff. So we actually looked at that tool and we saw huge potential for this to be utilized to help practitioners as well as evolving the research area in crisis communications. So what we've realized in this research is this is like an ever-growing specialized research track we are planning on continually working on. So we've actually looked at a couple of situations over the last couple of years in our research. So we've taken the extreme cases. We've looked at workplace violence. And we've also looked at natural disasters. So you have basically two opposite ends of the continuum looking at different levels of responsibility for the parties and organizations involved. But we realize there's so many different crisis situations possible, but what we have found initially within some of these initial scenarios, we've also done a food safety situation, but we've also done an athletic athlete tweeting something that they should be tweeting. So we've done a couple of testing scenarios, just kind of figure out, are there any similarities? Are there any unique differences? And so what we have found, which is one thing that just talking with the researchers that I've worked with in crisis, and then also Kristin and I talking with practitioners, they're like, this is perfect. This is great research that we can apply, because what we have found is that, yes, there are some similar things that people are looking for in hearing in crisis messages in a situation, but they're different. You have to personalize the situation and the messages to that specific audience. And so it's been really a fun track to work on these last couple of years. And Kristin and I have been, as she said earlier, kind of geeking over, some of the numbers, like, oh, this is working. And so, of course, I think it's just been a really fun project to bridge, and I know we've talked about this over the years too, bridging also the research with practice. This is easily applicable research that could be used in practice. So it's really exciting to see the real world implications of this as well.
I'm really excited to get into detail, like to go into this with you guys. Okay, so hold on. Just backtrack a little bit. So talking about the different types of crisis scenarios, at first you mentioned natural disasters, and then you said workplace violence. So we're talking active shooters and things like that?
Yes.
Both of which are crises where the organization is also a victim. So it's not self-induced, or, they stuck their foot in their mouth, or they did something unethical, or whatever the case may be. But then you also looked at other cases where the crisis, the organization would technically, to some degree, be at fault.
Yes.
I think that's a pretty fair roll up, because we started working this as an aspect of this as a project for the Reputation Institute. And of course, they're interested in corporate reputation, corporate crisis management. So a lot of the scenarios that we already kind of had ready to do some analysis on were of that nature. We have looked at this a little bit in terms of individual crisis, but we haven't delved into it quite as deeply.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then when you are talking about the different audiences, can you define what audience groups and different stakeholder groups you looked at particularly?
Yeah. Well, one study in particular that we wanted to look at were, of course, crisis experts, people working in the industry. We wanted to see what their definition was of a crisis. And we wanted to compare that with people who have had no training whatsoever in crisis. Because one of the things that Kristin and I, and along with other professionals working in the research, one of the things that we kept on seeing in the academic literature is you have these experiments, all these surveys going across and being conducted, but everyone was using students, for the sample. Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, students, their view of a crisis might be completely different than the everyday person. I mean, they have their own viewpoint, their own perspective. So why are we basing our research on determining what the best crisis message is on students? So we actually wanted to do this to kind of show the research community and really practice, like, okay, it really all depends on who you're looking at for your audience. And what we found is we definitely did the situational cues over some of the leading experts in crisis communication practice, but we also surveyed students, gave them the exact same situation. We asked them, what in your mind is a crisis? And our students were like, well, I missed an exam. My boyfriend broke up with me. I don't have enough money to meet the end of the month. So, I mean, it gave us a perspective like, okay, this is their mind, like their first impression of what a crisis is that can influence how they react or what things that they're looking for. So,
it's such a valid point, and it kind of brings up, or it makes me think back to a couple years ago when I started really marketing myself in my profession, and that I was doing Google ads for the keyword crisis. And I can't tell you over the first week how many midnight calls I got with people who were suicidal. I mean, they were going through a midlife crisis, or they were going through their own personal crisis. So one, I had to quickly be able to provide them with some kind of resource that was much better than me to handle things like that, because that's not my area of expertise in terms of crisis management. And then two, I had to redefine my ads and what the keywords I was targeting. So it's really a valid point, saying, missing an exam is a crisis for a student. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then you have people who are looking for a kind of life coach to help them overcome their this isn't what I want to do with my work crisis. And then you do have people who have legitimate personal crises, who are, lost close family members in accidents, and they're going through some significant emotional events. But that's kind of a totally different ball.
Yeah.
And and I think that, it's important to know the different interpretations of what a crisis is. And I think it was kind of an interesting, viewpoint on how people define crisis. And it really was something that Kristin and I were able to bring forth, at some of the conferences. And that really kind of piqued the interest and collaboration efforts that we've been doing with Firestorm Solutions on this research. They were like really interested. They're like, wow, this is research that can be applied and also contribute to research. And we're like, yes, this is the overall goal, and I think that's kind of one of the things that I think sometimes is missing. And that was one of the things that Kristin and I and our team really kind of looked at, was really working on research that helps practitioners in the body of literature move along. Because sometimes we see some people just kind of stay in their own little corner where we're like, okay, we need to bring forth all of these respective disciplines together, all these respective people together to move the field forward in this way. So it's just
and sometimes when we're doing this, the best thing we can do is kind of get those definitions on track.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about crisis, like Karen said, there are all these different groups who have different perception of crisis. So let's go out and try and figure a way to actually kind of quantify what a crisis is. So taking into account all these different individuals, we started with the one group and tried to see if we could actually get some observable, again, quantifiable metrics on what exactly a crisis is, so we could have a more common dialogue across all the different spectrums.
Of course. So after you got some feedback from students, I guess particularly who were talking about personal crises and that, you had to shift it to, okay, well, now let's talk about organizational crises, because that's what the research is for.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with the students, once you clarify that, what was interesting, once we clarified that point, with the students, like, it's like, okay, we're not talking about midlife, personal, final exam crisis here. We're talking about organizational crisis, or we're talking about environmental crisis, or, something to kind of be a little bit more specific and walk through. And they're like, oh, okay. So then they get that to a certain extent, but then they still feel like, well, that can't happen to me. Like, my life is perfect. Like that, this, like a natural disaster won't impact my town and stuff like that. So,
and that's a natural human, which is why, people like me in my profession, and Karen, you as a consultant as well, we have, sometimes it's a struggle with organizations, because you have to get them to see that, yes, we do need to prepare for the worst, because the worst, it's not something that only happens on TV or to the neighboring town.
Yeah.
Well, and the hard part, too, is getting them to focus on a crisis for more than about 2 seconds. I mean, we're seeing it right now in the second week of humanitarian relief for the earthquake in Nepal. We've been working on coordinating efforts with the international community to respond to this absolutely devastating earthquake. But then there are people who've just kind of, okay, I donated I had the option pop up on Facebook for me to donate. What more do I need to worry about? And it's kind of like trying to, their organizations like to go after the next shiny object. And crises are not just bam and done. There are lingering, lasting effects that people need to be aware of and to focus on. So that part is incredibly difficult.
Absolutely, especially when it's so far. I mean, speaking of Nepal, as of the recording of this morning, Nepal just experienced another earthquake.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a continual crisis for them right now. And I think part of the challenge, especially for organizations here, is we saw it differently when, Hurricane Sandy and different things. We saw it more, I think, continually through support of communities and organizations and individuals here in North America. But it's difficult when it's so far away, when that relatability factor is kind of more blurred. That's always a struggle as well.
Well, even with Hurricane Sandy, I was up in New York at the time, and we had, there was obviously some issues and some damage, but they got most of that cleaned up pretty fast. So it was kind of, okay, recovery is done. You go out to Connecticut, I went out to Connecticut to see my aunt, and there's still a huge amount of reconstruction going on a year and a half later.
Absolutely.
And it kind of does bring it back home that even though it is right there, it's not over and done. Recovery isn't done just because this one area is recovered.
Yeah. Yeah, part of the struggles. Okay, so for your research, talk a little bit. I'm dying to ask what the research revealed that actually makes a good crisis message. But before we go into the results, talk a little bit about more about the study and what got you the results. So what were the maybe more about the Q-sort method and all of that.
Okay. Karen, do you want to run through the Q-sort procedures, or do you want me to?
I could do that, and if you want to jump in, and that's totally cool. So
okay.
So what the Q-sort methodology, as Kristin was able to talk about earlier in this session, it's a tool that is popular. Basically, is a way for us to quantify qualitative attributes in a very concise and reliable way. So a Q-sort basically measures those first impressions people have. And this is what really kind of piqued our interest is with this methodology. We get to basically see what people's first impressions are when they see something, when they're exposed to a message or exposed to a situation, and we're able to quantify that. We're like, awesome, cool, this is fabulous. We definitely need this. And we were both we were shocked that this was not really utilized in crisis communications. Like, of all places, we need to be aware of what people's first impressions are if they see a crisis message, let alone determine what they are expecting to see. So
I think it's not used too much because the model really isn't understood very well. It's a fairly simple process where you take a number of different attributes. I think it's 89 for the situational Q-sort. It is 101 for the traditional Q-sort.
Yes.
But you sort them into all these different bins. There are 9 different categories, and you can only put a certain number in each bin. And it's a very small number at the extremes. It's larger in the middle, but those extremes are the ones that really tell you what is most and least characteristic of whatever it is you're trying to evaluate. I have tried with I don't know how many statistical tests to break the correlation in these tests, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, you get a number of people with a subjective impression, and you can build a model that will predict pretty accurately how people are, accurately to within a p-value of like 0.0001, what a population is going to expect from a particular situation. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so with the Q-sorts, which is amazing, and both Kristin and I, and even our mom on some of our projects, well, we've had to basically communicate, like, especially when we're getting this research published, like in academic journals, that everyone comes back like, what do you mean you only have 8 people to test this message? You need to have more people. And so we've had to go back and we've added more people. And we're like, okay, we added more people and it's still the same.
And it changed nothing.
It changed nothing. So it's a very reliable, test that is very easy to do. I mean, it does take time to actually do the situational Q-sort because basically you could either do it electronically or in person. And the person may take about 30 minutes to do it. It might take an hour, but they're thinking through the process of, sorting through these attributes into these bins. So once you do that, once you've collected all the data, then you run your tests. And as Kristin said, it's very reliable. And Kristin, didn't you talk to a few of your statistics professionals, like even at Virginia?
I took it to my data mining professor. And my data mining professor, he is at the top of his game. There is a particular statistical predictive analytics professor that Malcolm Gladwell refers to in one of his books for taking some pretty significant gambles in the stock market and winning just because he had broken down the data. Well, that was my professor who he was referring to. And we sat and we did I don't know how many different sampling, resampling tests on this, and we could not figure out how it got this strong correlation. Mm-hmm. The closest we could figure out is just because of the forced binning. Mm-hmm. Because it creates a forced distribution of these different characteristics, but the impressions are such that you can create a pretty significant model.
Yeah, which is pretty cool.
And Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I did it, right? You sent it to me, and I was part of it.
You were one of our professionals.
Just kind of thinking about my own experience, doing it as when you guys sent it over to me. Yes, it took some time. It was certainly time I had to block out of my schedule to sit down and focus on it. But you're absolutely right. It's only being allowed to put certain a certain number or a certain amount of attributes or descriptions, whatever the case is, into specific bins that really makes you think. That's where the thinking comes in. Mm-hmm. So you can only put in X amount into, this extreme definition of a crisis, for example. And so everything else may have looked kind of severe to you, but when you can only pick 3 or 4 or whatever the number is, then you really have to put that. So I can understand why it's so impactful and consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really do appreciate you taking the time, because we know these things. We know the Q sort is not easy to work your way through, especially when you don't have somebody. Because we've got a number of different products that we've developed now, kind of that we've been doing the Q sort for a while on helping people get through, figure out exactly how to do it and how it works. Because sometimes people look at all the different. We used to do it with printed note cards. People put it in envelopes, and they'd look at all these note cards and go, "Oh my goodness, how can I possibly discriminate between all these different characteristics?" Mm-hmm. But
so considering that I did that portion of the study, what happened next? So you're talking about, I believe, it's been a while since I did it, so I believe that it was more about my role, or what you asked me to do was really defining what a crisis is and what a crisis isn't.
Right.
And then, but we're talking about, what actually makes a good crisis message was the overall goal and objective of the study. So then after that, what happened next? Like, how did you get to those answers?
Well, for this one, what we did is we created a profile then for a crisis as a situation. Figuring out, again, kind of those extremes are the ones that, it's with just about any data study. The interesting things are always in the extreme tails of the distribution. So we wanted to figure out what was most and least characteristic. So we kind of found a profile of the different characteristics that crisis managers and crisis professionals think a crisis embodies, and then the things it doesn't. So in this particular case, just a couple examples. Crisis professionals honed in on, this is a need for quick decision or quick action. Things are happening quickly. It's complex. It's uncertain. And then, of course, there's the element of human suffering in there. So we're looking at all of these things. So we need decisions. We need action. When it comes to the crafting of a crisis message, Karen and I have started breaking out different kind of categories that the crafting of the message can fall into. Decisions, action, comforting, providing information, things like that. So we can start saying, okay, this population really wants decision, action. They want to see people doing stuff. So the messages need to contain information on what people are doing, and sometimes decisions that can be made or supported, and actions that can be taken to help. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how we look at doing that. We look at matching up the message and the message qualities mm-hmm. with what that particular population is looking for. And Karen, I don't know if you want to talk about the other study we did. It was one of our earlier studies on how we decided what a good crisis message was.
Yeah, so one of the earlier studies that we did was looking, actually, this is the Hurricane Irene one that we did, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So we actually partnered up with 2 professionals, Kathleen and Gina. Gina is a weather risk specialist. So the way that I interact and think about copy, she thinks about like that with weather. And then Kathleen.
Oh, yeah. What an analogy.
Exactly.
Comparison.
She lives all things weather.
Oh, yeah. She's like the weather guru. And so Kathleen at the time was working at the CDC. She's now the director of health up in Oregon at the Public Health Authority. So we were able to work on this project, this collaborative consulting research project with them. And so we actually looked at Hurricane Irene, which was the hurricane that happened right before Hurricane Sandy. It hit basically the East Coast and whatever. So what Kristin was able to do, we were able to collect social media updates during Hurricane Irene to kind of determine what constituted as a good, quote, crisis message. Because one of the things that the CDC was looking at was, okay, how do we know what messages we put out are going to be effective? That was like the main question that Kathleen, who was working in the Division of Communication and Surveillance for the CDC, was interested in looking at from a social media and crisis perspective. And so what we did was we collected the data, and Kristin was able to create a value model determining what were the messages that were most effective. And going through the data, I remember thinking, I spent a couple of years down in Florida, and Kristin and Scott spent time in Florida. And this was my first time hearing about hurricane parties. I was like, what is a hurricane party? And then, of course, I got educated on that because everyone's like, yeah, there's a hurricane, you have a party. I'm like, we don't have earthquake parties and,
Okay, wait. So for listeners, what is a hurricane party?
A hurricane party, as I was able to learn.
As we found out during the hashtag hijacking.
Hijacking, yes. Basically, people would get together at homes, drink lots of beer, get together, have a party because you were stuck indoors for a hurricane. And which for me, I lived in Gainesville because I went to Florida for my undergrad. And we had tons of hurricanes like my last year. That was the year of Hurricane Katrina.
And you get in, you batten down the hatches, you make some drinks. The hurricane is actually a pretty tasty drink.
Oh my goodness.
Kind of like a margarita. I forget what exactly is in it, but it's kind of like a margarita.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully nobody gets injured from the hurricane because everybody is intoxicated.
Right.
Yeah. We would.
But what we were able to find as a result was basically construct and provide back to Kathleen and also write up in our report. And it's a published article, and we'd be more than happy to provide you with a link to and a copy of the study if you'd be interested, Melissa.
Yes, please.
We definitely found like there were certain things that worked well with some of the messages that were coming across during Hurricane Irene. And there were some actual steps like, yes, you need to be aware of. Like this was back in... Yeah, it was a while ago. So it was a couple of years ago.
This was back when, it was back when I was at Virginia. So it was probably 2010, 2011 we did this.
Yeah. And so that we were basically noticing that there was no coordination whatsoever with hashtags. There was a lot of, as Kristin said, hijacked hashtagging. There was really like the ones that, the messages that had links and actionable steps that they were taking responsibility and getting the messages out to their respective audiences were the most effective. And
we also, I think a lot of this jumped into your credibility study that you did later, Karen, was food safety, because there were a lot of qualities there that involved source credibility and establishing that source credibility that we were only just kind of beginning to understand then. But, I mean, now you have verified users, you have verified hashtags. Twitter has made a lot of jumps towards actually getting the credibility pieces in there. You have organizations that are developing, here are the hashtags. We're going to publish these on a number of different sources so people know what the approved hashtag to follow for information is. And you've got those kind of hard punching messages that's not just, oh, hey, let's do this. Let's not be fun and frivolous. Because that is the number one credibility killer for crisis.
Yeah.
I don't know why people think these things are fun and frivolous and let's make a joke about it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you're saying that this initial study on Hurricane Irene was in 2010, 2011, and you're absolutely right. Back then, I mean, look, Boston Marathon bombings were 2 years ago, and there was a lack of consistency in use of hashtags with local authorities, all the different authority groups and government agencies that were that were investigating the bombings. And this is 2 years ago. So whatever, 2015, that was 2013. And then so go back to 2010, 2011, it was almost unheard of back then.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And we found different jumps in people, or different organizations are making larger leaps towards getting these things fixed than others. One of the biggest things, and this could be another study completely, just because I think it's completely interesting, the trust and mistrust of social media as a tool. I mean,
that would be
so many different
study.
Organizations have had little internal crises over the use of social media, bad tweets, hackings, hijackings of accounts, and threats made over accounts. There's so many different things that happen, and that has resulted in some people actually saying, okay, we need to embrace this, we need to understand this, we need to figure out how to protect ourselves, get our message out, talk over these other people, own the conversation. And then you have other ones that will put out policy letters and say, okay, everybody needs to be off social media. So we've had to overcome that in dealing with crises with some of these organizations.
That would be a really great study, actually.
Yeah.
On the to-do list.
Yes, there's never there's always so much research that needs to be done, but I think it's important to be able to have these conversations and say, okay, this is what we need to look at. This is going to help all of us in the field. And so I think one of the great things about some of these projects and working with Kristin, not only is she an awesome sister, but also we're able to bounce back ideas and use our different areas of background, whether it's systems engineering, whether it's PR, or even, with our mom, in psychology, we're a team, we're able to bring forth all of these ideas from different perspectives. And I think that's kind of where the field is going. And I think with social media, it is a hub platform, it's a hub tool, an online form of community where we all are seeing some of these same, trends, but maybe coming in from different perspectives. And so this is kind of like, for us, this research agenda kind of moving forward is this call like, okay, we need more people coming together to kind of talk about these things rather than just staying in our respective fields and organizations.
I think one of the things we've been doing well, Karen, especially to bridge the practitioner academic example,
yes,
is showing that we can't just throw all the old theories out. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of this stuff still applies. We're just having a faster conversation and more people are able to talk, which means it's not so much that, okay, we have to abandon all these other theories and all this research people have done. We actually need to educate more people on how to be good crisis spokespeople, how to craft the message properly, even just kind of the etiquette of messaging. There are all these different things that we can put together and package and share for more people to get involved in the actual craft of messaging.
Exactly.
Which actually brings us to, or is a great segue. Thank you, Kristin. So with this study and looking at also different stakeholder groups and categories of groups of people, what actually makes a good crisis message have you discovered?
For a good crisis message, you need to have actionable information. There has to be that credibility element. We found that including links to backup information, because people want the highlight, but they want to be able to dig deeper too. Having a link to further information is especially important.
Especially when social. I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but just kind of to add a little note there, people think that that Facebook, for example, that's going to be where they're going to communicate in a crisis. And what is very important for listeners and for any communicator out there to really, really comprehend is that the organization absolutely needs a crisis communications home base on a digital landscape that they own, digital real estate that they actually own. So their domain, their blog, their newsroom, their whatever it is, because Facebook, Twitter, all of these things, first of all, communication needs to be short and to the point and concise and timely and all those things. And then that link back that you're talking about, Kristin, is so important. But it's very important also to add to that and to realize that all of these social tools, they are rented real estate. And if you get locked out, like the Calgary floods 2 years ago, they tweeted so much throughout the floods, which was wonderful because there were no deaths within the city limits as a result of the floods, which was a total major success. But they actually got thrown into Twitter jail because they tweeted so much. So people, and so many listeners and so many people, when I say that when I'm on stage and things, so people are like, oh my goodness, what the hell is Twitter jail? But it's actually a thing where it's algorithms. And if you tweet too many times in the course of an hour or the course of 24 hours, Twitter actually locks you out of your own account. And there is no calling Twitter to say, hey, we're in a crisis, reactivate my account. So it's
especially when you have the links that you need.
Exactly.
It is like, oh, you're sending out spam.
Exactly. So it's their algorithm. So they say it's to prevent spam, but it's also to make sure that, we don't see that big blue whale anymore and Twitter goes down. But so it's very important for communicators to realize that, and that it amplifies the message of linkbacks. It amplifies the message of having that home base, and it amplifies the message of using hashtags. Because in the case of the Calgary floods, for example, a very, very bright police officer in Calgary said, oh my goodness, we're locked out of Twitter. They just realized what Twitter jail was when that happened to them. But he was so quick to jump onto his personal account and continue to message and communicate with using the same hashtags. And the city, citizens and the community did not lose information because they were following those hashtags. So it's kind of just like encompassing everything that you guys have just said.
No, that is a perfect example of synchronized communication. And I can't harp enough on the whole synchronization, pointing back to that hub, having organized, all that rented real estate, having the same hashtags and the same kind of not same accounts, but consistency in accounts, consistency in voice, pointing back toward that hub for more information is just critical.
It really is. It really is. And I think that people today, we can tend to get very boggled down with those social media, and we forget to go back to basics and to remember that. And not just that, but I mean, after the crisis is finished and is over and it's back to, business continuity and rebuilding brand and things like that, you want those communications, especially if you communicated well throughout the crisis, you want those communications to be found. You want future investors and stakeholders and journalists and students, whoever your stakeholder groups are, you want them, if they're looking for it, you want them to be able to find your communications, not just what everybody else said about you in the crisis. And it's by having that hub, that crisis communications home base, and which also goes into, the fact of, people are right now, they're pretty hung up on, dark websites. Dark websites is the crisis communications home base. And dark websites are they're a great resource. They're a great tool for certain specific types of crises, for certain specific types of industries. But as a rule, the dark website gets turned off again after the crisis, and they're talking about you want your communications to be found long after the crisis. That takes that away, amongst other things.
Exactly. You lose your continuity, and that is some of the more important, just especially when you consider how long the effects of a crisis can linger. You want people to be able to point back to those early actions and say, okay, what was done here? Why was this done? Maybe we can look and see how we can continue to work on this particular problem. And if you get rid of all of the discussion, all of the background information, you can't go back and do that analysis.
No, you can't. And then you lose the narrative as well. If you did really great at positioning your organization as the voice of authority and calm and accountability, credibility in the crisis, you don't want to take that away post-crisis. No. You don't want to lose that. But Kristin, I totally cut you off. You were describing the details of what actually makes a good crisis message, and I apologize. So oh
my goodness, what did I hit so far? I think I hit a majority of the points. I'm trying to. Karen, did I miss anything?
No. Well, I was just going to add, along with your great points about, being able to have credibility, to be, decisive, to have information, to have link backs to a link.
I think actionable information pieces.
Absolutely. And so one of the other things that we also were looking at too with this research, in terms of looking at the crisis message, is looking at, okay, we have to have a spokesperson. And we were kind of, bouncing around the ideas. Is there a certain template or personality characteristic that fits?
Yes, voice.
Yes, voice. Yeah.
So type of voice is very important.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so one of the things that we've done in terms of the research is to look at what are some other attributes that people look at from a crisis manager. Like, okay, it's one thing to say things, but, we've all been in situations where we've had a spokesperson saying, here's what's going on in this crisis. But we do look at the source of that crisis. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is kind of looking at how a crisis manager, how they're displaying duty. Are they personally taking responsibility, saying, yes, these are the actual steps, as Kristin said. Are they able to address adversity and negativity, and being able to adapt those behavioral actions, both visually if they're on camera, but also, as you've mentioned with the Calgary floods, taking leadership in that role and saying, okay, we are in Twitter jail, which also I found out during my social media class this past year what that was. And I'm like, well, I'm probably almost guilty of doing that for my class. But anyway.
Did you get locked into Twitter jail?
No, I didn't, but I think I've been very close.
Okay. Well, it's easy to do that, especially like Twitter chats and all these things. It's very easy to tweet 100 times in an hour.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I've been very close to going to Twitter jail, yes. But we were, definitely talking about how within these duty, adversity, negativity, action steps, is that instinctive? Is that something that people, do crisis communication professionals have a certain personality that works better in their profession or others? And so we kind of were tapping back into the psychology of using the Q sort and saying, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should give a personality Q sort to see, is there a distinct personality that is effectively, present among crisis managers? Because I think there are people.
That's what we did with our social media influencers a while ago. We did a Q sort on the personality of somebody who is a social media influencer, and we found some very salient traits.
Yes.
And there is, like with any trait, there is training we can do on how you project those particular characteristics. But I think in a lot of cases, you just have to have somebody who's very passionate about what they're doing, or at least is projecting that impression.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope is true?
Well, it sounds cynical to say, but you can have somebody who is very passionate about what they're working on, but just is not able to come across that way for whatever reason. That they're sitting there, that maybe they're nervous in front of a camera, maybe they're just unprepared. How do you take that person who could granted that a lot of people who are working in crisis are very interested in getting and very passionate about that duty piece. They have a duty to help in a crisis. How can we capitalize on that and get them to project that?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about, did you do this study, or this is a future study?
I think this is a future study. We did the study on the social media influencers, but we haven't done one on crisis professionals and crisis spokespeople.
Okay.
Again, it's kind of to-do list.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Karen.
Well, I was just going to say, we looked at crisis managers for their insights of what a crisis is for the situational Q sort. But within that, it kind of is this triangulation. We're kind of going back to the social media influencer study that Kristin talked about was done back in 2010. Which, looking at the citations,
that was one of our first ones.
That was one of our first ones. But all of a sudden, now that you're seeing all these influencer marketing for PR, social media, or even crisis situations, everyone's like, oh, there's a study, let's cite it. And so, so when we were looking back of what people were expecting to see from a message, that kind of brought us back, well, okay, what are they looking for from a crisis manager? Are there certain personality characteristics that are resonating more with these individuals versus other professionals that are in different types of communication situations? So kind of is coming all back full circle. So yes, more research, but we have lots of years to do it. So it's all good.
And the other thing I think with crisis leadership too is looking at, you guys have mentioned it so often in this conversation about credibility. One study that comes out every year is the Edelman Trust Barometer, and credibility in leaders, in whether it's government entities, financial institutions, CEOs in general, are the least trusted representatives or figures globally by everyday people. Mm-hmm. So, that's a huge impact too, that organizations need to come to terms with and start strategizing, okay, what can we do to reshape this? How can we start rebuilding this credibility and this trust for the heads of the organizations that in a major crisis need to be front and center? So how do we make sure that stakeholders are actually going to believe when they talk and trust what they say?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, therein lies the question. That you figure that out. That is the golden nugget of leadership.
Yeah.
Getting it. How do you get that person out there in front who is credible, who people will turn to? And that is something that we are kind of exploring. And we see good examples of it. And we can do case studies on those, but it's really tricky to quantify. And I think it really just comes down to the perception by crisis managers, how duty pops up as the number one, as the top characteristic, or the top characteristic of the crisis. And I think it reflects back on the characteristic of the leader too. Somebody who feels a sense of duty to their people to provide the information that's necessary, to provide the messaging that's necessary, and to help.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Oh, it's well, I could talk about this for forever, as you both know. Ladies, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I think it's really interesting. I love that it's a study, and I think that I talk about things like this all the time on the podcast, but it's really nice to take the angle of these are studies that were conducted, by academics that looked at it from a different perspective. And Karen, I know you and I have had so many conversations on, theory versus practice and bridging the gap between, I know the both of you together have had countless probably discussions on that. So thank you so much. So where can everybody go to find and follow you guys and see more of your work and maybe even get a copy of the study? I don't know if it's available.
Oh, yeah. We'll be able to share that with you. I have a PDF. Well, what I'll do, if you want, Melissa, we can definitely send you a couple of the PDFs of the Hurricane Irene study and as well as some of the situational Q sort work we've done. So
yes, please. So those will be linked from the bottom of this podcast, no matter where you're listening to it from, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, or melissaagnes.com.
Cool.
And then, but then where can they follow you guys? Because I know they're going to want to.
Karen has a lot of those studies also on her blog. So she's at karenfreberg.com/blog. And I have a few of them hung on my blog, although you're also going to find a lot of food studies there because it is, gastrodiplomacy is kind of my thing.
Yeah.
Making a better world through food.
Yeah. Kristin makes excellent food. And of course, like I always have to work out afterwards because I'm like, okay, if I look at this anymore, I'm going to want to bake it, eat it, and, need to burn off calories. But
see, that's our next study. We have to do Yelp credibility and TripAdvisor credibility studies. Yes. How much can those create a crisis for a restaurant? And then, of course, we have to sample the restaurant.
Absolutely.
The hardship of studies.
Yes, twist my arm, but of course, especially twist my arm if we have to test out coffee shops. I mean, that would be. If someone has to do it, I guess I will. I will be the guinea pig.
Hey, we can go and do credibility of different coffee companies when they're social responsibility. We can look and see. We can look into that. Oh, there are just so many things to study. This is awesome.
Yeah, I know.
It's awesome that you both have such a passion to do it.
Yeah, and Kristin, you can follow Kristin on Twitter at KC Sailing. And then
I'm on everything is KC Sailing.
Yeah, same thing. K Freberg.
Consistency and branding.
Yeah,
I think that it's awesome how you guys just shared each other's links. I don't know if you noticed, you just did that.
We don't rehearse this. We just, it's been a family thing for a while. We are the family that researches together.
And cooks and hangs out. And so I think that's really cool. And it's great that we've been able to collaborate on these projects. And I'm really indebted to Kristin for her bringing her expertise on board, because I think this is, her work in value modeling and systems engineering and crisis leadership in her work in the Army is really beneficial. And I've learned a lot from the process. So it's been, she's not only my sister, but she's been a great team player. So it's been wonderful working with Kristin on this.
Well, I would say likewise to Karen. I mean, she pulled me into a whole new world of analysis. And not only that, but it has been invaluable in looking at crisis messaging and creating those messages. Not just for the work I do. I work in coordinating humanitarian relations right now. But I actually had a chance to observe what we studied when we had the hurricane a while back in Hawaii. So I was sitting there the whole time on live media going, okay, here are the credible messages. Let's share this one. Let's talk to this one. Let's pull this one in for analysis. And it's been, but not just fascinating, but useful. We were able to get the right information out at the right time.
Wonderful. And thank you to the both of you for taking the time to come here and share your experiences and your study with us.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you, Melissa.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast with me, Melissa Agnes. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to this Crisis Intelligence Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher so you don't miss out on any future episodes. While you're at it, feel free to leave me a rating or review on iTunes. This will go such a long way in helping me get this important information to more people just like you to help benefit their crisis management and crisis communications. Additionally, if you'd like to have me come and speak at an upcoming event that you may be organizing, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. You can email me at melissa@melissaagnes.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.